from, no, I think East Coast somewhere, right?
New York.
New York. And he was kind of a computer electronics guy. And eventually moved to Mexico. He's very much into Mexican orchids. And he's come to talk to us tonight. He's brought his lovely wife with him and a couple of friends that he meets down in Mexico every once in a while are joined us tonight because they wanted to see the talk and get together with him. So we did it that way. And I'll turn it over to TJ at this point.
Thank you. Yes, I live in Vallarta. I've been there for 20 years.
Another thing is, because some people make
use the mic.
no, microphone.
Can you use the mic?
It's we can use it. You don't have to speak to the microphone.
No, it's okay.
Sure. Okay.
I work with theater, so I know how to project. I've been living in Vallarta for about 20 years, and I've been rescuing orchids. I don't grow them, I rescue them for about 15 or 16 years. Now, let me explain rescuing orchids. We go into the wild, and we find branches that have fallen off of trees due to age. We find trees that have fallen down because they got old or because their roots no longer keep them in the ground. The orchids that are growing there are now down here at ground level and will either get eaten by animals or washed into a stream, into a river, and into the bay. So we collect them, take them with us, we give them a home, and they give us beautiful flowers. I work with the botanical garden. I'll tell you more about that later. And what I want to do is I want to tell you about all the orchids of Mexico. Now, unfortunately, if I were to spend only 15 seconds on each one, we'd be here until well past midnight. So what I'm going to do is show you a slight presentation that represents a little over 1/4 of the orchids of Mexico. And while you're looking at all the pretty pictures, I'm just going to tell you stories about some of the more, what I consider the more interesting orchids of Mexico. Many years ago, I read a story about a guy in Florida who was given a Mexican orchid, and he didn't know what it was. He grows orchids for a living. He has 3 or 4 large greenhouses, and he said, "That's okay. I'll get it to bloom, and then I'll be able to identify it." Well, 3 or 4 years went by, and it didn't flower for him. And he said, "I must be doing something wrong." So he started doing different things with it. Different light, more light, less light. More water, less water. Tried different combinations of fertilizers. Well, after about 15 years of this, we finally got frustrated. And he had a visitor from California, also an orchid grower. And he just gave him the plant. Well, the guy took it home with him to California. And he said, "I'm going to try a few things." He tried more light, less light, different fertilizers, different potting mixes. The plant kept growing, mature, but it didn't flower for him. Now what he does, he takes a lot of his orchids out of the greenhouse in the summer and arranges them under the trees in his backyard. So they get the benefit of day and nighttime temperatures, the dust in the air, which contains a natural fertilizer, and of course, fresh rain. And in fall, he takes his orchids and puts them back in the greenhouse. Well, after about a dozen or so years of not getting his orchid to bloom, he's putting his orchids away, and he said to this one plant, "I'm tired of you. I'm going to leave you out here all winter." So he stuck this plant in a remote corner of his backyard. As it turns out, that winter, it snowed. Not unusual. It snows about every 3 or 4 years where he lives. But he's sitting there having his coffee at breakfast, looking out at the snow in his backyard, saying to himself, "Yeah, that orchid is dead." Spring comes along and he's in his yard, he's cleaning it up, breaking up the dead leaves, getting ready to put his plants out for the summer. And he looks over in the corner where he put that plant, and there's a huge spray of flowers. He was now able to identify that orchid as Arcturus iridescens. It has two very interesting characteristics. The first of which, it will not bloom unless it experiences freezing temperatures below 0 Celsius. Now, depending upon the source that you read, it'll survive -4 or -8 Celsius, depending upon the source that you read. That makes it difficult for most people to grow in a greenhouse, especially in places like Florida. But up here in Montreal, you got a shot. If you can get it to bloom, it may contain as many as 100 flowers. And late winter, early spring. And the flowers are about 4 inches across. The second interesting characteristic, this is probably the only orchid that has a G-shaped notch in the stamen. Now what this does is when a bee comes to do what a bee does with flowers, one of its legs will get caught inside that T-shaped notch. As the bee is struggling to free itself, it sheds itself of all of its pollen. As far as I can tell, this is the only orchid that says, give me the pollen and nobody gets hurt. Because of this characteristic, this orchid is a monotypic orchid. If you're not familiar with the term, monotypic means for this genus there's only one species. Not unusual, there are a lot of monotypic orchids and other plants, and a few animals too. Another orchid I'd like to tell you about is another monotypic orchid from Mexico. It was first seen by humans that we know of in 1985, which was 30 years ago. And at that time it was brought in as a dried aviary specimen. We looked at it and said, oh, it's a Cafeopedia from Mexico. Well, 3 years later, a bunch of botanists went into that area where it was reported from, and they started searching around. They found 7 plants. They scoured the whole area, and 7 plants were growing in an area about 1 hectare in size. If you're not familiar with the area, it's about 2.5 acres. Not very large. They brought home samples, started looking at it, and they say, no, it's not a Papio because it must be Fragmipedium. So it was published in 1990 as Fragmipedium xerophyticum. The species name is because it grows on the edge of the forest, but all of its neighbors are cactus and succulents. It's a xerophytic orchid. Grows where it's dry. A couple of years after it was published, a couple of other botanists got involved, and they turned on their DNA analysis machine and said, no, it can't be Fragmipedium because, and it doesn't match the characteristics of any of the other slipper orchids. So therefore, we're going to give it its own name, and it's called Mexipedium xerophyticum. In 1997, this area suffered a forest fire. A few years after that, botanists went out into that area, and they found one plant. There are people who now have this plant growing in their gardens, in their greenhouses. I spoke to a guy about a week and a half ago. He has one that's almost in bloom. He's very proud of it, and he knows of a few other people who are growing. This is a small orchid. I have a photograph at home. You'll see it come up on the screen in a few minutes. But I have a photograph at home, it's not on a slide presentation, of the flower, and a man is holding a dime next to it. The dime will cover the flower. It's that small. very interesting Mexican orchid. Well, it used to be called Oncinium cebolita. Cebolita is the Latin and Spanish term for little onion. And it's called that because the leaf is shaped like the leaf of a small onion or scallion. Although scallion leaves are hollow, this one's solid. I first found one years ago, and I brought it home, was able to identify it, and the book I had said the leaf can be typically 12 inches, could be as long as 16 inches. So I'm looking at this plant with a 19-inch leaf, saying, well, looks not. Then I found another source that said the leaf can be anywhere between 16 and 20 inches long. And then about a year later, a friend of mine and I were driving through the countryside. We saw a dead tree, and we saw one of these hanging on one of the branches. And so we got out, took a rope, threw it over the branch, and that was enough weight to bring the branch down to the ground. That one had a fairly large orchid on it. We took it home, and I have a photograph at home of a 23-inch leaf, about 57 centimeters. The base of the leaf is about this big around. The Oncinium cebolita would go, but you know, taxonomists in it, changing names. And it's now called trichocentric cebolita. The leaf starts going up like this, and as it matures, it does this. Because of this, you really can't grow it well in a pot. It has to be metal. Okay, here's it in a pot. It'll be happier if the leaf be pendant. Of course, the flower spike goes up like this. It's one of the dancing lady orchids. Now, those of you not familiar with dancing lady orchids, if you show up here, when you look at the flower, you find that her skirt is flared, she has her arms out, she has the headdress. Now, one of the interesting things about the trichocentric cebolita is that in ancient times, the Aztecs used the leaf as a substitute for peyote. I have a friend in Puerto Vallarta who is very familiar with these kinds of things. We'll go into details. And I discussed it with him. He's a bit of a chemist. And took a sample of a leaf and got back to me a couple of days later and said, yes, the leaf does contain a phenolphthalein alcohol, but not one of the hallucinogenic types. So we discussed it, we figured that it's either the power of suggestion or the shamans of the time had a process. And if it was the shaman of the time, the shamans of today still know about it. It's still a secret among the shamans. Another interesting Mexican orchid, very popular, it's called Laelia gouldiana. It's an orchid that has a paradox that goes with it. It was first found in the 1880s. Botanists were going through, and they found it growing on fence posts in people's yards. They found it in trees, and they found it attached to the front of houses. This orchid has never been found in the wild. It's extinct. It's extinct in the wild. The theory is, when that particular valley was settled, a couple of 3,000 years ago, when the man cut down the trees and the bushes, made farmland and pasture land, they found this beautiful flower growing. They took it home to their wives, their sweethearts, and their mothers. This is the only reason why this orchid exists today. Recent DNA analysis has shown that there's a total of 5 different strains. So, of all the orchids that once existed, existed, only 5 individuals made it out. And now the divisions and clones of these are all over the place. You can find them in a lot of the better orchid stores. One of the interesting things about this particular Laelia, you can grow it from backbones, just like Cymbidiums. It takes 2 or 3 backbones to do it. Now the paradox that I mentioned, this orchid species name came from, is named after a man named Ray Gould, who at the time was one of the richest men in the United States. This orchid comes from one of the poorest areas in Mexico. Yeah, it's like that. There it is. Said to be one of the prettiest of all the lands. I'd like to also tell you about one of my favorite orchids. It's one of my favorites because it has such an interesting history. And because of all the orchids in the world, over 30,000 of them, it's the only one that's used for food. It's a characteristic that it shares with bromeliads. There's about 18,000 different bromeliads in the world. Only one is used for food. First, we were going to talk about is vanilla. If it wasn't for vanilla, Coca-Cola would have a different flavor. If it wasn't for vanilla, your Christmas cookies would taste different. A lot of your cakes would be different. We wouldn't have pound cake. At Christmas time, we wouldn't have those little yellow things called peaks because we wouldn't have marshmallows. We wouldn't have a drink called Harvey Wallbang because we wouldn't have Galliano. Ladies, a lot of your cosmetics would not smell as nice. A lot of your perfumes would not smell as nice. And doctors, many of your medicines would be less palatable, all because of vanilla. And this is just a sample. I can go on and on for an hour. But I won't. When Christopher Columbus set out to find a shorter route to India, and accidentally opened up what we call the Age of Discovery, the world did not know about vanilla. It was the Totonaca Indians who live on the east coast of Mexico, who about 10,000 years perfected the art and science of everything involved with vanilla. When they were conquered by the Aztecs, 1427, 65 years before Columbus had sailed, the Aztecs demanded a tribute from the Totonaca Indians. The Indians gave them vanilla beans. And it didn't take long for the Aztecs to realize this was a valuable product. In fact, for many years, vanilla beans were used by the Aztecs as currency. When Cortez visited Mexico in the early 1500s, Montezuma served him a drink in a golden goblet. Now this particular drink was reserved for royalty, warriors, and an extra special people. Montezuma loved the drink. 2 of the ingredients, one of them was vanilla, and the other was the ground up seeds from the Theobroma cacao tree. Somebody recognizes it. The seeds of the Theobroma cacao tree is the base for chocolate. Another gift from Mexico to the rest of the world. Montezuma found out what these ingredients were, and he started shipping them to Spain. The people in Spain liked the vanilla beans because they had such a wonderful aroma. They hung them in their houses to make the house smell nice. Ladies wore them in their hair to make them smell nice. Well, this is before people took baths on a regular basis. Well, actually, they take baths on a regular basis, but it was in June, which is why June is the sent plants back to Spain. The vanilla plant grew and it flowered, but it did not produce vanilla beans. And when word got back to the Totonaca Indians that the Europeans were getting flowers, not vanilla beans, you know what they said? They said, that's the revenge of Montezuma. Well, you see, by now Montezuma had been killed. There's 3 or 4 or 5 different stories as to who and why. It's a whole other subject. This began a 350-year monopoly Mexico had on vanilla beans. The Europeans took their plants that were thriving, shipped them to other parts of the world. There were other colonies. The plants grew, and on rare occasions would produce a vanilla bean. It wasn't until the mid-1850s, 350 years after Cortez, that a Belgian scientist working in France figured out, oh, it has to be pollinated. And he figured out how to pollinate. Unfortunately, his notes weren't that good because other botanists couldn't live any other place in the world. They tried moving into other areas. Within a year or so, the colony dies out. After the scientist discovered pollination, a 12-year-old boy figured out how to do it. Oh, by the way, he couldn't read or write. He was a slave. This young boy followed his master around because the master was cross-pollinating different plants, and the boy tried it out vanilla. Said to his master, look, if you do this and this, it starts to grow. His reward, he was put in a coach to go to other farms on the island to teach the other farmers how to hand pollinate vanilla. That was his only reward. Well, for a slave running a coach, being treated like royalty. That was the end of Mexico's 350-year monopoly. You've heard of bourbon vanilla. Bourbon vanilla has nothing to do with Kentucky sour mash, Jack Daniels, and such. Bourbon vanilla is called because it comes from Ile de Bourbon, the island of Bourbon, which is now called the island of Reunion. It is different from other vanilla because the processing is slightly different. In Mexico, you harvest the vanilla bean. I'll tell you about the vanilla bean. It'll be 7 to 9 inches long, and the diameter of a zucchini. You harvest it, you lay it in the sun. As evening comes up, you pick up all those beans, you wrap them in a wool blanket, you put that wool blanket inside of a wooden chest, cover that with a wool blanket to keep it warm. The next morning, you take the beans out, put them back out in the sun. And you do this for about 6 to 8 weeks. During that time, you will lose 2/3 of its weight. It'll start shriveling up. That is just the beginning process. Now, the first few days, the heat of the sun will kill the bean. When you first harvest it, it's still alive. So it's still trying to grow. I'm sure all of you have seen, you take an onion, you cut it in half, the other half back in the refrigerator, 2 or 3 days later, it's no longer flat. It's still alive, it's growing. This is why you have to kill it. Now, the bourbon method of killing, you harvest it and you dip it in hot water, about 150 to 180 degrees Fahrenheit, for 3 to 5 minutes, just enough to kill the live cells. Then it goes into the sun process where it dries the sun. It does impart a slightly different flavor. If you have good taste buds, you can tell the difference. Vanilla, being a natural plant, from one year to the next, tastes different. Same with grapes and wine. the same time as this young man on the island of Vermont figured out how to hand pollinate vanilla, there was a lady in Pennsylvania who invented something that created a worldwide demand for vanilla. Her name was Nancy Johnson, and she created, got a patent on, the ice cream churn. Ice cream has been around since the days of the Phoenicians. They would take cream, mix it with fruits and nuts and other flavors, pack it in a container, put that container surrounded with ice and wait for it to freeze. It worked. Thomas Jefferson served ice cream in the White House. He had his own recipe. Of course, that was the early 1800s, and the ice cream churn wasn't invented until about 1857, I think it was. But it did create a large demand for vanilla. So much so that vanilla production couldn't keep up. So scientists started trying to figure out, how can we create vanilla flavor artificially? And there were 3 or 4 different ways of doing it. 1920, there was a paper mill that processed trees into paper that was having a pollution problem. Well, scientists came along and started analyzing the chemical that they were having a problem with. And he said, oh, if we treat it with this, this, and this, and go through these steps, we can create artificial vanilla. So the artificial vanilla that you buy today is actually the result of the wastewater from coal processing. Properly treated. Interesting solution to a problem. About to get to some very interesting orchids, and I always say that photographs do not do these orchids justice. You really have to see one in person to get the full effect. I also say that if Stephen King or Steven Spielberg were to design a flower, it would look like a Stanhope. Rather bizarrely plants. Looks like you're about to be attacked. Other uses for vanilla, one of the things that I do with vanilla, when I make a pot of coffee, I put 2 or 3 drops in the coffee grounds. Just throw it out there, give it a nice flavor. I have a book on vanilla, which I'm going to leave with you guys. Which is shared around it. It has a complete history of vanilla. It has some unusual recipes. It also has some unusual uses. If you have a dark corner that has spiders and you want to get rid of them, you need to look into the book. If you're in real estate and you're trying to sell a house, vanilla can help. If you're painting your house and you really don't like the smell of paint, vanilla can help. I've been asked about photographs here. A few of these photographs were taken in my backyard. I took them. A few were taken out in botanical gardens. A lot of them smartphones. But every one of these orchids can be found in Mexico. Some are hard to find. But they're there. That's the Turkish sentence that we were talking about.
The mule here.
It's a mule deer, oh yes. No. Turkish sentence certainly is not a mule deer. Because Tahitiensis grows, was first identified in Tahiti, and they thought it was a mutation. And for many years they thought it's a mutation. In 2002, not that long ago, a couple of scientists were researching vanilla, and they said, well, let's see, it really has some of the characteristics of this one, some of the characteristics of this one. And they looked at it a little bit more, and they said, oh yeah, these two bloom at the same time and can be found in the same area. So it's very possible that these two crossed and created this hyphen. And then they started digging into old records and found out that the vanilla that's growing in Tahiti came from Manila in the Philippines. And that shipment came from this particular area in Mexico where these two grow, raising the possibility that it was a hyphen. Another group of scientists read this report, got out their DNA machine, and proved conclusively that yes, those two were paired. It was now called Vanilla tahitiensis, which is why it now has a small X in front of its name, indicating it's an actual hyphen. This is our orchid conservatory, just recently completed. Construction completed in June of last year and was officially dedicated in November of last year. The steps, you can't see the steps, it's created by the bushes on the right. The steps leading up to it are dedicated to Roberto Gonzalez Tamayo. Most of you may not have run across the name. As you look through orchid books, and you see drawings of orchids, good chance you see his name near the bottom. Those are his sketches. He spent most of his life living anywhere from 6 to 9 months out of the year in the hills throughout Mexico, studying, sketching, and writing down the description of orchids that he found. And eventually got his degree and taught for many years at the University of Vallarta. Now, he passed away a year and a half ago, which is why we dedicated the steps to his honor. And I spoke to one of his students. The last 3 or 4 years of his life, he was blind. But even though he was blind, he was able to describe complete technical detail, hundreds of words, and they transcribed it. I had the first, it's not that there, first of it was 3 volumes of all the orchids that he described. Waiting for the others to come. Of course, it's all in Spanish. I have learned up in Spanish. The botanical gardens is about 20 acres, not very large, and it was started 10 years ago. In fact, this November 15th, we're going to celebrate our official 10th anniversary. It was 10 years ago on Father's Day, 2005, when my wife was reading in the newspaper about a new botanical gardens that had just opened. And she said, let's go down and see it. I have to tell you a funny story leading up to it. About 3 years before that, I was traipsing through the hills with a bunch of people. We were looking for orchids that needed resident. And we crossed paths with a group of 3 or 4 guys that were traipsing through the hills, crossing us. And we sat and chatted for a while, showed up what we had found. And this one gentleman showed me an orchid that he found. It was leafless at the time. And he said, I think this is a catasetum. And I looked at it and said, no, I think it's a cloacea. So we get down to the botanical gardens, and I'm walking along the path, and I see this gentleman coming up to me. And I kind of recognized him, and he kind of recognized me. And it took about 10 seconds for us to realize, yeah, we had met several years before. He said, oh, by the way, you were right. And that gentleman is Bob Price. And he and his mother used to own a very successful restaurant in Florida. And Bob would take a 1 or 2 week vacation every year and come to Vallarta. Bob has been interested in plants since he was a youngster. And he's always dreamed years ago was when they bought it. It was pasture land. So all the buildings that are on the property constructed by Bob. Well, he didn't actually do it. The funding for the botanical gardens has all come from selling their restaurant, donations, memberships, almost no funding from government sources. So this is truly a private botanical gardens. One of the interesting things that has happened to our botanical gardens, on the board of directors, I can call it ours. In 2013, I forget the name of the organization, it's a Canadian organization publishing a list of botanical gardens worth traveling to. 2013, for the first time in their history, they put the Mexican botanical gardens on their list. It was ours. A few months ago in March, they published the list again, and we were on the list again. We share that distinction. There's a list of 10 botanical gardens total. We share that distinction with the Montreal Botanical Gardens, the Botanical Gardens in Atlanta, Bouchard Gardens in British Columbia, Japanese Tea Garden in Oregon, a couple in California, a few other places. I have the list somewhere. I didn't get it from this. So we consider ourselves to be a very distinctive company. Is there anything I can answer? Any question I can answer? Well, what I'd like to leave you with,
I have a question. How many of those orchids have perfume?
how many of them have perfume? How many of those have? When I first started getting interested, a little bit interested in orchids, I lived in Southern California, and I went to a place at the time it was called Stewart's Orchids. And Messina, I think it was. And the professor there told me 2% of the orchids will be fragrant. 2%. Now this was 40 years ago. Nowadays, we believe about 60% of the orchids are more fragrant. Quite a few of the ones that you saw are fragrant. Most of them have very nice aromas. I mentioned Cloesia. There's a couple of Cloesias on the screen. They're green. One was Cloesia russellani. I like to describe that as a green dragon. It's a pendant cluster. Looks like a bunch of grapes of green. And you can smell that where it's growing in my backyard. It's probably 28 feet to the back door. And then from the back door to my front door is another 30, 35 feet. You smell it at the front door. Very strong, especially the first window. That one has a, well, I like to take my coffee out there in the morning with some loaves for aromatherapy. It's kind of a mix between a camphor and a eucalyptus. Very lovely. There was one up here in Green William. He smells like a wet dog. Not very nice. Several of the ones up here are white orchids. And if the white orchid is fragrant, it's fragrant at night. I'm sending some legion or something here. That has a very, very good fragrant. Recipe Vallarta. Kind of smells like a grapefruit. Recipe Mendoza is known as Lady of the Night, and you can smell that one 40, 50 feet away. So, very, very faint. Now, if an orchid has an aroma, it's strongest the day that it opens. And as time goes on, it gets weaker and weaker. I can tell you from experience, Brassavola cuculata opens during the day and it's only fragrant at night. And I discovered by doing research that what's a fragrant orchid? I didn't know that. I've got one in the backyard that just opened today. And I went out there and I could smell it about probably 8 or 10 feet away. The next day I had to be within 2 feet to smell it. And the next day I had to be within 6 inches to smell it. This is typical of fragrant aromas. Common aromas are floral, rose, cinnamon. Vanilla has a very, very faint vanilla aroma. Very, very faint. But interesting enough, it is strong enough to keep spiders away from the plant. Spiders don't like the aroma of vanilla.
What's the name of the first orchid you're talking about?
Arcturus iridescens. Arcturus, A-R-T-O-R-I-M-I-S. Iridescens. You're going to try to find one, aren't you? You're going to try to grow it, aren't you? Oh. My wife wants me to show you a slight presentation I put together for the botanical gardens because at the botanical garden we're an education place also. We bring in students, plus loads of students. Now normally there's an admission charge. If a school makes an arrangement to bring in students, we don't charge an admission. We're education. So
That's why it belongs to the Mexican.
So what I'm going to do,
So
to get out of this.
why does your botanical garden make the top of that list? Why does your botanical garden make that list?
I don't know the reasons.
Versus other botanical gardens in Mexico?
Because we're so diverse. If you're interested in cactus, go over there. If you're interested in tillandsias, go over there. If you're interested in orchids, go over there. We have a very diverse collection of plants. I'm sorry to say they're not well labeled. We're working on that. My wife would like me to show you.
But it's
Here's a bunch of unusual orchids. I'm going to leave you with the book that I wrote on vanilla. There's all the details of the history. It has pictures of about 3 dozen vanilla orchids. There's about 110 different species of vanilla. Only 3 of them are used commercially. And as it turns out, all 3 come from Mexico. That's from your library. I'm also going to leave you with a CD, which contains all of the photos you saw, but with more information about each one of those orchids. You just saw pictures, same pictures, but with detailing. Just drop it into your computer, and if you need to share it with somebody, please do. It's not copyrighted. I like to share information.
What is the name of the orchid which needs freezing temperature?
Arcturus iridescens.
Okay.
Needs to freeze before it'll bloom. It grows above 8,000 feet in Mexico. And sad to say that the area where it grows, trees are being cut down for logging purposes. It's losing its habitat.
Is it similar to Is it similar to another type? Another type of orchid?
Not this one. A few years ago, I wrote an article in Orchids magazine called The Orchid Clock. Now, the Orchid Clock is a way of, oh, yes, very popular in Japan.
Yeah. So do you spend a lot of time in the jungle finding rescuing, yeah, orchids?
In my car, I drive about 10 miles into the hills. It takes about an hour because the roads are like this. And then there are lots of trails I can go up. So yeah, it's a day trip. And then I bring them home and put them in my backyard. I've got about 30 different species of orchids in my backyard. And typically, I can go out any day of the year and find an orchid in bloom. No, I don't have a greenhouse. I don't need one. The coldest. Years ago, women were not allowed to see orchid flowers because of the sexual connotation. Understand why?
Amazing what nature can do.
And nature does some wonderful things.
Yeah.
People say that gives you shoots, new growth. Second member gives you flowers, which eventually gives you fruit. The third member gives you root growth and plant stability. So the higher, when you're in a period of time when the plant is growing new pseudobulbs and leaves, you want to give it a fertilizer. The first member is high. And of course, with orchids, weekly. Once a week, open the week solution. By filling in an orchid clock for each of your orchids, or at least each genus, you can now go into your greenhouse with 2 or even 3 different fertilizers, and you can say, okay, you get the blue fertilizer, and you get the green fertilizer, and you get the yellow fertilizer. Yeah, it's really simple. I'm proud to say that when this was published, I received about 18 emails from people all over the U.S., several other countries. I got an email from a guy in Greece, asked if he could translate it into Greek. Got an email from a guy in Venezuela, asked if he could translate it into Spanish. If somebody wants to take the time to translate it into French, go for it. Because this will help anybody who's growing orchids to grow better orchids.
So your fertilizers come in different color, or you color them?
They come in different colors.
The explanation is on the back as well.
Sorry?
The explanation is on the back.
Oh, yeah.
And he's leaving that so you can take copies of it. Or download it on his website.
Share this with your friends. I'm also going to leave with you the Botanical Gardens is funded by a lot of different things, and one of them is tiles that we put on the floor. And you get to design your own tile. We have tiles that were in remembrance of pets, orchid societies, their logo on a tile. We're asking this orchid society to put your logo on a tile. There have been tiles for weddings, anniversaries. We have a friend from Terrace, BC, who has a tile down there. I think it was their 25th wedding anniversary. And she tells friends, when you go to Puerto Vallarta, find my tile, take a picture, and when you come back, I'll give you a present. So I'm going to leave a couple of those in case somebody wants to have a tile. Canada, so you can get a tax-deductible donation. Revenue Canada, whatever it's called, it changes name. No, it's still Revenue Canada. Okay? The place where you send your money at the end of the year, April, end of April, right? But you can get a nice tax deduction. I'm also going to leave with you a few copies of Botanical Gardens newsletter. It's bilingual, but in our case it's English and Spanish. If you're learning Spanish, it's a good way because the Spanish was written by native Spanish speakers. Use English as a second language, but they speak English quite well. You can learn a lot about botanical gardens, the things that we have there, the different events that we have. There's a calendar of events for the entire year. Now, this is the first time our newsletter has been printed. This is for the 10th anniversary. I have a few of these at home sealed in plastic because I figure 10 or 20 years from now it'll be valuable. And I'm proud to say I sold most of the ads in it. It costs money to print these things. And I only went and talked to businesses I trust. So there's a lot of good restaurants. Puerto Vallarta has a lot of good restaurants. About 350 of which 340 of them I would go to eat any day of the week.
TJ, would you please give them your email address for the orchids?
Oh, sure. I'll also leave you a few business cards. It has my email address on it. So if you decide, if anybody decides they want to visit Puerto Vallarta, contact me. I'd be happy to give you a tour of the gardens, introduce you to all the important people there. You can always contact me through the gardens itself. There's the first page, it's called the masthead. Some contact information down the bottom. Either one of those people know me quite well. If you would like to be on the mailing list, we send out an electronic newsletter once a month. If you'd like to be on the mailing list to receive the newsletter, ask. It's free. I'd be happy to. A very, very pretty lady named Michaela who can answer you back. If you want more information about what's going on, the other contact, a guy named Neil, will get back to you. Something I didn't mention about the conservatory is for native Mexican plants. A few years ago, we have a guy on our board of directors who's a professor at San Houston State College in Texas, and he brings students down every year. And about 3 or 4 years ago, he and his students were traipsing through the woods, and they found a tree that they didn't recognize. Justin, professor, got his PhD in trees. The term is this long. So he took samples, took it back to the lab, analyzed it, and a new species of tree was discovered just a few years ago. Just a few miles from Botanical Gardens. It's called the Vallarta magnolia. We have a couple of them growing on the property. When they built the conservatory, they not only put in the orchid propagation lab, but they also put in a dormitory. Eventually, we'll be able to sleep 18 students. So we're encouraging people to come down on field study programs. We talked to the people at Dartmouth College a couple of weeks ago, and they said, oh, field study program? So, is there any other questions I can answer? I thank you for your time. It was enjoyable. Lovely crowd. And I hope to see you in Puerto Vallarta pretty soon.